Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you are safe and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. When we initially planned this session, it was going to be a pretty straightforward assessment of Russia's war against Ukraine as we enter the fourth year. And to a large degree, we're going to focus on that in the beginning of the hour. That said, if you had to identify a single factor that could arguably change the character and the trajectory on the battlefield, reshape American views of the war, undermine or alternatively strengthen a European role in whatever the solution is, it's what the Trump administration has said and done in the last 30 days. While Trump's notion of ending the war in 24 hours has gone the way of the dodo, it's quite clear they've injected a good deal of energy into framing issues that in which they might argue would seek to end the war. And they've also injected uncertainty, some might argue much more than uncertainty, in what I would consider to be the four foundational principles of the Biden administration's approach to the war. Number one, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Number two, supporting Ukraine, quote, as long as it takes. Number three, isolating Vladimir Putin and Russia with sanctions and political isolation. And finally, coordinating very closely with European allies. Now, whether or not what appears to be the undermining of these principles are headlines or trend lines remain to be seen, but there are a lot of questions. Where are we 3 years into a war that seems to have no prospect of abating? How is the situation on the ground, on the battlefield, likely to change? What are the new factors in 2025? What is the administration's strategy? Do they have one? How is Putin and Zelensky coping with the new reality of the Trump administration? And what are Ukraine's options? Has the Russian economy reached a tipping point? What can we expect on that front? And also the internal politics of Russia. How do we assess the European factor in all of this? And finally, perhaps the most elusive question, is there a deal? And if there is, what would it look like? Happily for me, I don't have to answer any of these questions, but we have four extraordinary panelists who can. And I can't imagine four wiser or more experienced heads to help us unpack everything that I've identified. I'm honored also to call all four of them colleagues. I'm not going to give them, in the interest of time, read their resumes. You can read those on the website, but you'll see how extraordinarily experienced they are during the course of the hour. Michael Kaufman is a senior fellow in Russia and Eurasia program at Carnegie, where he focuses on the Russian military, Ukrainian armed forces, and Eurasian security issues. Alexandra Prokopenko is a fellow at the Carnegie Eurasia Center in Berlin. In her research, she focuses on the Russian government, policymaking, and economic and financial issues. Eric Jaramella is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasian program at Carnegie here in Washington. His work focuses on Russia and Ukraine. And Andrew S. Weiss is the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at Carnegie Endowment here in Washington, where he oversees research on Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. So before we get into Trump and how Washington is looking at this, let's create some ground truth if we can. So I'm going to go to Andrew and Eric first. Humor me here. If the two of you were briefing Stephen Witkoff, Marco Rubio, and Michael Waltz, what do they need to know, in your judgment, about Putin's and Zelensky's strategies and mindset as we enter the fourth year of the war? Andrew, to you first.
First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here with you, Aaron, and with my colleagues, and to mark this very solemn occasion of the third anniversary. I think from my standpoint, the incoming administration needs to understand that there are two big drivers of Russian actions in Ukraine. At the time the war began, Putin was being an opportunist and really thought that he could replicate the Taliban success and engineer a takeover of Ukraine where the government would be decapitated, the military wouldn't fight, and then the world would have to adjust to new facts on the ground. Within a few days, that clearly didn't happen. And since then, the Russians haven't totally given up on those goals. But in the meantime, they've been trying to grind down Ukraine and wait out the United States and our Western partners. And there's been a sense of confidence on the Russian side for the last 12 plus months that things are cutting their way. There's been political transformation in the United States. There's been questions of whether the war is sustainable for the United States and Europe practically in terms of the kinds of unbelievable military support we've provided to the Ukrainians to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. And then lastly, there's just dynamics on the ground where Russia, just by leveraging mass and singularity of purpose, has been able to show that, time is not necessarily on Ukraine's side.
Eric, to you on if you could on Putin and Zelensky.
Sure. So, I agree with what Andrew's laid out on the Russian positions here. I mean, on the Ukrainian side, Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are in a really, really difficult position. As Mike's going to explain when we turn to the battlefield update, things have not been trending in Ukraine's favor for the past year and a half. It's been tremendously costly defense against Russia's continued offensives in eastern and southern Ukraine. Ukrainians are exhausted. There's very, very difficult challenges related to manpower and recruiting for the military. And so there is this sense of, a desire for a change. And I think initially many Ukrainians welcomed the election of Donald Trump as this kind of X factor to shake things up and shuffle the deck in the hopes that maybe he would put Putin on his back foot and turn the tables so that Ukraine could find a pathway to this just and lasting peace that it's been, in search of. But I think, as you noted, the last 30 days have seen radical changes that have largely been to Ukraine's detriment in terms of initiating this U.S.-Russia dialogue without Ukraine at the table. So from a near-term perspective, Zelensky, Ukrainian officials, the Ukrainian parliament, they're looking for a seat for Ukraine at the table, and they don't want the terms of Ukraine's future security, prosperity, and democracy to be negotiated over the heads of Ukrainians. Number one. Number two, there is a near-term issue of keeping up Western support for Ukraine. And this means navigating this very delicate sort of tightrope exercise with the Trump administration to maintain this at least minimal level of American military support, intelligence support, everything like that, to continue to sustain Ukrainian operations. And again, this puts Zelensky in a very difficult position of having to defend himself against these unwarranted personal attacks by Trump, calling him a dictator and saying he started the war and so on and so forth, while, not going so far as to alienate Trump to the point that the White House just says, we're cutting it off and Ukraine, you're on your own. So despite all of this rhetoric, there has been a continuation of American military support to Ukraine, but it's on a knife's edge. Then we get to the longer term picture. And that's where we come up with the same issues that have bedeviled these conversations since the first days of the war. And that is, what will the future security arrangements for Ukraine be such that it's capable of defending itself and deterring against a repeat Russian attack? What is the combination of Ukrainian indigenous capabilities, defense industrial production, the sort of layout and structure of the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as the long-term Western support and potentially security guarantees that would be necessary to deter Russia in the future? And on that note, I haven't seen any new ideas coming out of Steve Witkoff or the Trump administration that would lay out this pathway to this kind of security framework that could give Ukrainians the confidence to enter into some sort of real ceasefire knowing that it's not just a recipe to allow Russia to rearm and prepare for another attack 1, 2, 3 years down the road.
Yeah. Before we move on to the military situation, Alexander or Mike, anything to add on the question of Putin or Zelensky's mindset as we enter year 4? Okay, then let's move on to the battlefield.
Hey, Aaron, actually, could I take
for sure. Go ahead, Andy.
I just want to add one thing. It's really easy to telescope everything onto the Ukraine Russia dynamic, but I do think there is a bigger sort of game going on in the mind of Vladimir Putin, which is trying to plant a lasting wedge between the United States and Ukraine, trying to plant a lasting wedge between the United States and Europe, and then trying to push the United States out of Europe entirely as the U.S., focuses or reprioritizes on other issues in the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's important to see that Russia's policy is operating on 2 levels as we focus on what's going on in Ukraine in the here and now. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a longer-term theory of success, I would suppose. We're going to come back to that. Mike, so let me ask you on the battlefield, realities on the battlefield. The Wall Street Journal puts it this way, quote, "The heavy losses for small geographical gains set up the, quote, brutal arm wrestle that will most likely characterize Russia's war in Ukraine this year. Can the Russians sustain or even accelerate their assaults and gain enough ground to force Ukraine, struggling with a lack of manpower and its allies, to seek an accommodation? Or will the offensive peter out in the face of Ukraine's dogged resistance?" So I guess the question, if you were doing a brief, Mike, for Secretary of Defense Hegseth, how would you describe the battlefield reality at the moment? And do you see anything changing in the near term in terms of breakthroughs or alternatively breakdowns?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. So I was there just recently, about a week ago, and I'll tell you that the situation I saw remains a very difficult one, but it's not dire. It's actually surprisingly not as bad as things look like they might be if you were observing the trends and trajectory of the war in the fall. There's a couple of reasons for that. So Ukraine has held the last 3 months, and the Russian offensive momentum slowed down. Part of that is just plain weather. Part of that is Russian forces have been reconstituting in terms of material. They lost a lot of equipment fighting over the fall. And part of it, Ukraine's just gotten better at adapting tactically on the ground to the way the Russian military has been attacking, right? It's probably all 3 of those things. So I suspect Russia's rather disappointed because despite the fact that they retain a very significant advantage in material and overall in manpower, especially in manpower, they've not been able to turn those advantages into big gains on the battlefield. They can't attain operationally significant breakthroughs the way that they've been fighting. Now, on the other hand, their approach is also one that doesn't lead very well towards exhaustion, meaning they can sustain a conveyor belt of men that they're throwing onto the battlefield. And even though they're taking high levels of casualties, Ukraine is too. It is a war of attrition. It's not a great descriptor, but I think it helps for a lot of folks to understand that it's not principally so much a war of terrain. This war won't be decided by who controls the next 20 kilometers of Donetsk, right? Yes, territorial aims are at least part of kind of what are Russian minimal war aims in this war, but they are at best lagging indicators and what is a grinding fight between both sides. And it's much more a question of what will happen first. Will the Russian offensive momentum be exhausted? And will Ukraine stabilize the front line? And to do that, they're really going to have to stabilize their manpower situation and address some of the structural issues that they've been dealing with as a force, right? Or will Russia keep grinding on, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, but eventually it could lead to a deterioration of the front because wars are just fundamentally unstable systems. And then you'll see territory giving away much faster as kind of the result of the fact that one force is basically depleted and exhausted the other force. And hopefully we won't get there. So far, Ukraine has proven a lot more resilient and has typically beaten kind of the more pessimistic expectations. Right now, from my point of view, Ukraine is not facing a collapse of the front line, but it hasn't stabilized the front either. It's way too early to sort of get cheery and say that because Russian gains have petered out these last 2 months, things have really turned around because the structural problems are still very well visible in both forces, right? On the one hand, Ukraine faces manpower issues and the way the fight is organized overall has made it challenging for them to stay in defense around Pokrovsk. And the casualty ratio is quite favorable to Ukraine. But if you look at the big imbalance between the manpower available and the manpower fielded by both sides, it's not so favorable that you can just sustain this indefinitely. Right. On the other hand, Russia has its own constraints, right? Russia has really poor quality of forces. It's increasingly facing material constraints that it's slowly going to be exhausting the useful, workable part of the stockpile of equipment that it's inherited from the Soviet Union. And maybe Alexander will speak to this. While Russia has a clear path forward in 2025, if it's not decisively winning on the battlefield this year, the picture for Russian forces doesn't get particularly rosy either. I think one of the big challenges for Ukraine, and I'll close out with this, is that Ukraine ultimately depends on external support. So does Russia, but much more so Ukraine, and much more so right now in the year of 2025. And I think it faces great uncertainty, particularly after the spring. Right? It's also unclear that the Trump administration is going to sustain the assistance that was paid for or drawn down by the Biden administration that's scheduled to be shipped over the course of this year. That is a policy decision for them to make, along with any additional assistance they provide. So bottom line, while you could argue that, yes, Ukrainian forces are exhausted and Ukraine does need a truce, perhaps ideally this year, it is not in such a desperate position that it needs to urgently negotiate from a position of weakness or just accept any deal. And that's not what the front line, or at least what I saw on the front line, would lead you to believe.
Right. Mike, before we move on to Alexander and the Russian economy and politics, just a couple points. I hope you'd be able to clarify what is the North Korean role on the battlefield? Is it a wash? Is it helping? Is it hurting? Can we expect additional North Korean troops?
Sure. So on the battlefield, North Korea has fielded essentially 4 brigades of light infantry, and Russians have been using them as assault troops since December. They are principally there assaulting Ukrainian positions around the Kursk salient and only around the Kursk salient, and themselves are trying to get experience. They're not well integrated with Russian forces, although Russia provides a degree of fire support for them. They took casualties December, January, then rotated off the front line, and when I was there, were rotated back and had begun attacking once again. As best I can tell, Russia has access to far more North Korean troops, and North Korea is replenishing these forces. How many, what the actual number agreed is, I don't think it's publicly known. They're primarily a factor in Kursk. Are they a decisive factor? No. If you look at Russian manpower requirements, Russia's probably been recruiting an average last year of over 30,000 men per month, contracting them monthly. And so the 10,000 or so North Korean troops that have been fighting are a fairly minor factor in this war, but they are freeing up Russian forces from having to fight in Kursk, and their Russian military is kind of moving up behind them and consolidating terrain while using them as the main absorber of casualties, so to speak, right? So they are playing as a factor in this role, as is all the ammunition that North Korea is providing for Russian artillery, and increasingly in some areas equipment, right? So that's the way I would frame it.
And what about the manpower issue on the Ukrainian side? We heard a lot about it. Is it that there simply aren't enough men of fighting age? Is it the way troops are used and deployed? Can you just frame the manpower issue for us? Because I think as the war goes on, it's going to become increasingly critical.
It's an unfortunate, complex issue, but the short answer is it's not an issue of Ukraine not having enough men. Ukraine has plenty of men and men of fighting age. In fact, if anything, this war is largely being fought by older men. The average age of Ukrainian forces is probably over 40, and on Russia's it's a bit younger, but it's still towards the mid-30s. The challenge is one of, first, mobilization simply not performing sufficiently, not delivering the amount of manpower that Ukraine needs. Second, Ukraine has a big issue with folks who are absent without leave. And this is a problem born of poor leadership and other factors, and people simply not being in positions or roles that they want to be in, so much so that they passed an amnesty law where you can go AWOL from your unit, and you can actually then even use that as a mechanism in practice, some do, to transfer to another formation, someplace that you'd rather serve in the military rather than where you're at. I'd say the third factor is simply also a question of exhaustion and some questionable choices last year when it comes to force management, force generation, meaning Ukraine had chosen to funnel mobilized personnel into new brigades that are being trained by the West. And that was not a very good idea. It deprived the force on the front line of replacements, and new brigades take a very long time to become combat effective. So they suspended those as of January, realizing it was a mistake, and are now driving newly mobilized personnel into existing units. But the problem has been an expansive one, and it led to some extent the Ukrainian military to start cannibalizing the force, pulling a percentage of people in support positions, specialists into infantry. The real problem, Aaron, is in infantry. Look, the challenge is that most casualties in war cluster in the infantry specialty. And soldiering infantry is ultimately a specialty, and it takes people, and you have to train them, you have to replace them. And that's where the real challenge on the battlefield. And Ukraine has adapted to a deficit of manpower, a deficit of infantry on the battlefield. And it has slowed down the Russian advances. But this is, to me, ultimately not a sustainable strategy. I mean, you can't do this indefinitely. You have to address the structural manpower problems.
Thanks. Alexandra, now to you. I wonder if you could give us a sort of overall assessment on the state of the Russian economy. But I want to quote something that you wrote because I think it frames up the problem. You write, I think in Foreign Affairs, waging war in Ukraine, maintaining high social and infrastructure spending to create an illusion of normality for his domestic constituents, and preserving macroeconomic stability is impossible to do in perpetuity. Achieving the first and second goal requires large outlays of cash, which fuel inflation and thus prevent the achievement of the third goal. And the cracks in the Russian economy are becoming increasingly apparent. But you then go on to say that it is a false assumption on the part of the West to imagine, your exact words, you believe that Western hopes for an economic crisis to pressure Putin rest on a false assumption. And I wonder if you just sort of unwind those two thoughts for us.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. So Russia's economic resilience has resulted from a combination of increased state spending. More than 10% of GDP were spent on the economy, mostly on military in 2022 and 2023. We don't have figures yet for 2024, but they are also significant. So then there was authoritarian friendshoring of trade and import substitution, which together have delivered a boost to consumption and investments. Also, an important factor is a capital lock-in. I mean, sanctions locked money within Russian financial system, and it helps in a non-direct way to the Kremlin. On the management side, I'd like to highlight the role of the central bank and the government. No one expected such a flexibility and professionalism from them, and to some extent, economists were much more successful than Russian generals at the field. So, with combination of this, we see that Russia's economy sustained sanctions tsunami. But the major pillar of this is cash, and Russia is not running out of cash. I like to say that Russia's economy is in a deep crisis, but it's far from collapse. In 2024, economic growth exceeded 4%, which was mostly a result of so-called overheating. And in 2025, it could be a pivotal year for Russia's economy due to, as I see, three structural constraints on the economic growth, which Putin cannot ignore anymore. And first and foremost, there is that the country is running out of production capacity, and all manufacturing is actually working on the clock 100%. And the second is workforce deficit, and well, sometimes can be done here. For instance, government allowed women today to work on coal mines and operate heavy machinery, but it's not a game changer. Russia's economy literally running out of people, and Kremlin doesn't have anything to address, doesn't have much tools to address this issue. third structural constraint was imposed by sanctions, and it's and the resource-driven nature of Russia's economy. So I do not expect no significant increase in foreign currency earnings because of the sanctions, and they are still there. So, but the safety cushion Putin Putin saved in the previous years will allow him to pass 2025. But these three constraints I just called, they will worsen in 2026, and we will see the different picture. So for central bank and the government, the key goal for 2025 is to maintain somehow a soft landing of the economy, of the overheated economy. And I think under latest development, they have a good chances to do this. So it's possible if Putin won't increase military spending. We don't. That's the major unknown. For now, I think that he will increase, but depends on which extent. And second is if Trump won't increase sanctions pressure. Sanctions pressure is important for. It's also important variable here, and if sanctions remain relatively the same, I mean on the same level, Russia's businesses and government will adjust, and they will pass 2025. But still, the constraints I named, they are structural, and they will worsen in 2026. So that would be a different picture. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, and I shall save it for a little while later, whether or not there's a quote maximum pressure unquote strategy that the Trump administration could apply if it was so inclined, that could accelerate the weaknesses and the structural deficits in the Russian economy. I'll say that one for later. Right now, I'd like if I could get you to comment on the political implications of where the Russian economy is. What is the impact of? We're now entering the fourth year of this war. What is the impact on the Russian elites? I know it's a big question, and on the Russian public generally. Can you offer some broad observations of how
Sure.
economics have factored into how the Russian people perceive the war going forward?
So yeah, sure. Speaking about people, massive payouts to soldiers and the broader surge in wages, which we witnessed during the last 2 years, have created some sort of a paradox. So while economic inequality has deepened, and that's undoubtful, many Russians feel that their standard of living improved because previously they had literally nothing. And now they can change the cars, they can pay their loans, or they can afford a mortgage to them. And surveys indicate growing perception of a favor distribution of wealth within the country, which is also interesting that 40% of respondents link their well-being to state wealth distribution rather than freedom, human rights, and other stuff. And this create a very interesting situation that, well, all this improvement can be temporary, and inflation already eroding people's well-being, and it will worsen. But if this feeling will persist that last 2 years, last 3 years were years of improvement of financial stance, it could cement a dangerous narrative among the society that Putin wartime will associate among people with the time of prosperity and economic growth, and peace, well, potentially will can be linked to decline and humiliation. And this creates a quite challenging political environment within the country. Speaking about elites, the situation here is that no one is happy with what's going on, but since they are, but since they are able to adjust, they are adjusting, and sanctions left them in a sort of institutional vacuum. So if previously they thought that they will have some, maybe not a safe haven, but some place they can go, now they literally locked within Russia, and they are adjusting to Russia's situation. But they don't have any kind of agency, I think, to encourage to act against Putin. So they are waiting how the situation will resolve, and they put a lot of their hopes on Trump as some external power that will change the situation and maybe open some West and some perspective to them.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I'll do it now. 4 weeks in, how has the perception of the U.S. changed?
I don't think that on a general, I don't think that in general the perception is changed. So elites and businessmen are still, so nothing changed. We heard a lot of words, but we haven't seen any kind of real actions. So people with money, they are like they were in a waiting mood, and they see what's going to happen. And in a public opinion, in terms of people, I don't see any kind of changes, and I don't see any kind of changes in propaganda. Russia's propaganda now trying to picture the situation like all Western companies and Western brands are, queuing near the Russian border, waiting for a time when they can just jump in come back to their assets, and this. Come back to their assets and their profits in Russia, but of course it's quite far from the reality, and so we haven't seen any actions yet. And I think Russian authorities are quite cautious. I mean, Russian central bank on their basic scenario, they're betting on a continuing of the war, on the continuing of the current situation. I mean, sanctions, so external pressure. So nothing yet, nothing changed. Only Putin and Trump talked, but that's Putin and Trump relationship.
Right. Fascinating. Before we move on to the administration, how they're conceiving, whether they have a strategy, the negotiations, the mineral agreement. Eric, I wonder if you could offer a few observations on on Ukrainian internal. We never really hear. I mean, as a non-expert here, I sometimes assume that Ukraine is a unitary actor, that it has no politics. I mean, clearly that's because of the war and martial law, but everybody has internal politics, supporters and opponents. So Eric and anyone else on the panel, could you offer an observation or two on Zelensky, how he's perceived? Is his stock going up? Is it leveled off? Or is it going down?
Well, Ukraine is a competitive democracy, and we saw this tremendous surge in domestic support for Ukraine, for Zelensky in the first weeks of the invasion, where prior to the invasion, his approval ratings were somewhere in the low 20s. He had made a series of, I would say, errors in how he had conducted certain domestic policies. But then Ukrainians rallied around their president, and when he decided to stay in Kyiv and to sort of lead the nation, he was enjoying support in the 90% area. That leveled off after I would say 9 to 12 months into something around the high 50s to low 60% range. And it stayed roughly there. But there has been a political ceasefire where, the opposition parties have basically agreed that there's no point in, kind of launching direct political attacks on Zelensky during wartime. He is the legitimate democratically elected leader of the country. And, the patriotic opposition is sort of, reaffirming his domestic legitimacy, and then waiting for the point at which the war ends, when politics will return fully and there will be an election. The main thing that has changed is now we have an American factor, which is President Trump coming in and criticizing Zelensky very directly. That has had the, perhaps unintended from Trump's perspective, effect of bolstering Zelensky and kind of reinvigorating this sort of rally around the flag effect inside Ukraine. And you have the main, opposition figure, former President Poroshenko, who, by the way, a few days prior to Trump's announcement accusation that Zelensky's a dictator, had come under sanctions from the Zelensky government for some deals that were conducted under his presidency with the occupied territories, that had led to some significant domestic criticism in Ukraine. But now you have Poroshenko coming out and saying, again, we as the patriotic opposition agree across parties that there should not be elections under wartime, because those would be fundamentally unfair and unfree elections conducted at the barrel of a gun without
Yeah.
international observers and so on and so forth. So we agree with the president's position that, again, he is in office. He's constitutionally in office until the end of martial law, until the end of the war, and then we'll have an election. So there is still this ceasefire in place. But there is a lot of jockeying behind the scenes. There is a good amount of frustration with some of Zelensky's over-centralization of authority, some of his decision-making, particularly on the domestic scene. But again, when you talk to his detractors, they still largely agree with the way that he's conducted himself in international politics and the degree to which he has sustained support from the world.
I mean, war does many things, and it can produce, particularly in a society that is geared and mobilized for war, wars can produce leaders. Is it likely or imaginable that when politics returns to Ukraine, that there are military figures who would emerge to challenge Zelensky?
Yeah, I think it's completely imaginable and likely, in fact, that veterans of this war will play a significant role in post-war politics.
Yeah.
I mean, most Ukrainians kind of see the main contender at this point in a presidential race, if there were one, to be the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Zaluzhny, who's currently the Ukrainian ambassador in London. Regarded as a hero of the war, beloved by the troops. Again, not without his, flaws and sources of criticism for the way that he ran the war in the first 2 years, but again, largely seen as this, hugely patriotic figure and perhaps a potential rival and challenger to Zelensky. But even Zaluzhny has said, listen, the time for that is not right now.
Right.
We'll talk about politics after we've won the war.
Yeah.
I think the big question for Ukrainians after the war is going to be about the balance between civil liberties, democracy, economic prosperity and freedom on the one hand, and the need for a strong security state on the other.
Yeah.
Ukrainians they jealously guard their democracy. When it's under threat, we've seen Ukrainians repeatedly take to the streets and challenge leaders who have tried to amass too much power. We saw it in 2004 with the Orange Revolution. We saw it in 2013-14 with the Euromaidan. But post-war Ukraine is going to be very different from the Ukraine prior to February 2022. And so Ukrainians are going to have to think about how they make these kind of trade-offs and what, if any, of their civil liberties they're still willing to have curtailed in the name of security against this perennial foe on their border.
Yeah.
They've been willing to make those compromises, certainly during martial law, for the sake of the nation. That equation is going to change after the war, but it's not going to go back to the way things were. And so that's where the question of the military's role in politics and the formation of state policy and domestic politics, the way the economy is run. I mean, to what extent is defense industry still going to be kind of the top strategic industry, and you have all sort of supply chains and everything geared towards defense industrial production? I mean, again, that is going to be a very difficult conversation for Ukrainians to have, and I think that's going to be the main topic really for the first post-war election. Fascinating.
All right, let's use the balance of our time to focus on the administration. I mean, I must say, the line from The Wizard of Oz keeps coming up since January 20th, not just with respect to Ukraine, but across the board. When Dorothy lands in Oz and turns to Toto and says, "We're not in Kansas anymore." I mean, I really get the sense that we aren't in Kansas anymore. So let me ask Andrew a question that none of us are going to be able to answer, but I think it's we have 4 weeks of this. Does the administration, in your view, Andrew, and this is a question for everybody, have a strategy? Or are we witnessing a strategy based on instincts, prejudices, and a certain constant that Donald Trump doesn't create wars, he ends them. What do you think?
It's been a very disruptive few weeks, putting it mildly, across the board, right? And you see this in domestic policy, you see it in foreign policy, and you see an intense desire for attention, right? Every day, if you stop looking at your phone for 5 minutes, you're going to miss the new twists and turns. And then, so I think we've seen what amounts to shock and awe in both foreign and domestic policy. We've seen a desire to just kind of transform the nature of how the U.S. operates in the world, to remove predictability, and to try to, put huge initiatives on the table, often, that are contradictory or that are unachievable. The situation with the desire to reset or just normalize relations with Russia as an end in itself has been, I think, a North Star for Donald Trump since he was first, presidential candidate in 2016. So anyone who's not been expecting Donald Trump to kind of put that above everything else probably wasn't paying close enough attention. In parallel to that, we have a Russian government which is very skillful, very well prepared, and very good at dangling ideas in front of the Trump team. There's frankly, there are very few people who've been put into, the national security roles that require confirmation. I think at this point, it's probably fewer than a dozen. I don't have a tally, right at hand, but it's a very small group of senior policymakers that are sitting in place at this point. But as in 2016 and 2017, the Russians have sort of floated, beguiling ideas that, Russia might want to peel away from China, that Russia might be able to peel away from Iran, that there could be big economic opportunities from the US and Russia collaborating again. So to me, all of those, kinds of ideas are now sort of turning the heads of the president and the senior team, and not really sort of bearing down on the really urgent dilemmas that the war in Ukraine would force, in a normal situation, would force upon the senior members of their team.
Again, will headlines become trend lines? Will Donald Trump discover at some point that Putin's objective is not simply to end the war? Will he change course? He's quite capable of doing that. But I guess I'd press you, Andrew, or anyone else on the panel. In 4 weeks, this administration has fundamentally changed the foundation of the way the previous administration related to the war. Are there foundational principles, do you think, constancies, which the new administration is conceptualizing? And that those foundational principles, whether you like the Biden strategy toward the war or not, those foundational principles created a strategy. Are there anything remotely resembling that, do you think, other than we need to end the war?
I'll go first. I think the desire to have a normalization of U.S.-Russia relations is the priority, and there is a tearing hurry to arrange a leaders' meeting. So that's not a strategy. That's a leader engagement. But I think that has become at the moment the short-term priority, and that meeting could happen in just a few weeks' time.
Yes.
That there's all indications that the ground is being laid for that. In the meantime, we've seen massive disruption in the cornerstones of U.S. policy towards Ukraine that you mentioned at the outset. Those are recoverable. The U.S. could try to build leverage in a serious conversation with the Russians about Ukraine. And the ways to do that would mean, seeking another emergency budgetary supplemental from the Congress to show the Russians that we're not about to cut off the flow of military support. You could see transformation of the European position, where they could offer to underwrite a lot of the costs and to do more. You could see them seize the frozen Russian central bank assets to pay for part of that. You could see Europeans step up and offer to deploy forces inside Ukraine to monitor a clean ceasefire. And I'd let Eric sort of define for folks some of the trade-offs here of like what a serious timeout would look like in a way that wouldn't disadvantage Ukraine. So you could see all of those elements come together that would put the Russians in the hot seat and, ask Vladimir Putin, are you serious about ending this war or not? I think I know where he'll come out, which is he's not serious. But again, you could see that kind of policy be put together. But in the meantime, it really is, I think, a flurry of activity to, kind of get as much attention and to demonstrate that the policies of this administration are very different than their predecessors.
Yeah. I mean, one of the, Eric, do you want to add anything, or Mike or Alexandra? I have a question on the minerals agreement and what's the dynamic there? Ukraine's vulnerabilities, Russia's or Trump's objectives. Eric, do you want to add anything on the presence or absence of an administration strategy? Or Mike, or Alexandra?
Maybe we can come back to the minerals deal in a minute, but on the question of whether there is a strategy, I would say, yes and no. There is a strategic instinct, like you laid out and like Andrew mentioned, to end the war. Beyond that, there's really no kind of clear conception of what the American national interest is as it relates to the outcome of this war. I mean, ending wars is a good idea under any circumstance, but clearly the United States has a stake in Ukraine's future security, in European security, and so on and so forth. And there's a spectrum of outcomes, some of which would enhance America's interests and security, and some of which would detract from that. And by kind of failing to define at least the general directionality of where we're going and what kind of outcome we're trying to pursue, I think it makes this less of a serious sort of effort than it could be. I was heartened at first, I think, by a lot of the statements by General Kellogg, who had laid out, I thought, what a very clear and logical position that, yes, the sides need to talk. Yes, we need some outreach to the Russians, but we also need to help the Ukrainians build leverage, strengthen their position, as Mike was talking about, consolidate the front lines, fix manpower issues. We need to kind of work these things with the Ukrainians, with European partners, and then we go to the Russians and we have a little bit more leverage built up.
Right.
I think what the president has done in the past few weeks, to me, it is pretty confusing, because I think the gratuitous swipes at Ukraine and Zelensky don't do anything really to build U.S. leverage. I mean, it's a leverage destroyer. I mean, what Trump should be doing is building bridges with allies and partners, talking with the Europeans, getting us, really pushing them, as Andrew was saying, to lay out what they're willing to put forward in terms of financial resources, military personnel, ceasefire monitoring mechanisms, and all of that, and then work with the Ukrainians to figure out what the left and right parameters are of their position, so that you come to the table at that point with the strongest and most coherent and unified possible position. And instead, by shooting off in a lot of different directions and putting the cart before the horse and talking about all these great economic opportunities with Russia and totally forgetting the whole kind of post-war security picture, which is going to be the thing that's necessary to lock in this ceasefire, to me, it is very unstrategic. And I don't see how we get from here to a point of sort of coherent talks where you get a ceasefire that can last.
Right.
I mean, it's on that too.
I mean, it's a complicated negotiation, and yet you've got Keith Kellogg on one track holding Zelensky's hand in Kyiv, and then you've got Witkoff, Waltz, and Rubio meeting in Riyadh, preparing presumably for a Putin-Trump summit that could occur within a matter of weeks. If in fact, I want to talk about whether a deal is possible, but I want to give Alexandra and Mike an opportunity just to lay out briefly that if in fact the Trump administration followed Eric's advice and wanted to create leverage, the L word, before it became involved in serious negotiations and probably far too many giveaways. On the military side, Mike, just briefly, what would have to happen to demonstrate to Putin that the Trump administration was serious about supporting Ukraine? And Alexandra, to you, is there a maximum pressure economic strategy that might work? Just briefly, the two of you, if you could. Mike?
Okay, sure. But Aaron, I also thought of some of the other questions you were engaging in the conversation. On military leverage, there isn't too much we can do at this point. Like, Ukraine does not suffer from a major imbalance of artillery ammunition, and the leading problem they have is not equipment. And also, we're having major problems with inventories that a lot of people don't realize. Much of the foot dragging last year was due to shortages of inventory, folks not wanting to release what they had and taking a very long time to process and send it. I think the best thing they could have done was go to Congress, ask for another supplemental for the defense industrial base, maybe if we're dealing with China, but include several $billion for Ukraine to show that we are still vested in sustaining and supporting the Ukrainian military in this war, along with Europeans, at least through 2025, right? To make that clear. We could have also maybe changed some policies, ship some things faster, what have you. But these are nuances, right? We're not really at the point where I think there could have been a dramatic difference in military assistance that could have really reshaped the battlefield at that stage. Now, some folks may disagree with that, but just looking at where we are and what we've given in 23 and 24, I don't expect that to happen. I think from a leverage point of view, most of the leverage is going to come from the economic side, right? In terms of threatening additional sanctions, a much more expanded approach on enforcement, these sort of issues. And it looked like that's how they started off. The Trump administration really began with sort of a slogan of peace through strength, but very quickly we've seemed to move to peace at any cost and on the shortest possible timeline.
Right.
Which may also, as Eric alluded to, it may not really be peace, because there's absolutely no reason why a ceasefire that's signed now is going to bring any kind of lasting or durable peace. The previous ceasefires in this war have not done that, if you recall 2014 and 2015.
Right.
And the war is indeed about broader issues in European security. And if you make major concessions on those in order to get a document that just says the word ceasefire on it, then you may have basically achieved a tactical success, but from a more strategic point of view, and I hate to get into grand strategery, it may end up being a big misstep.
Right. Alexandra, on the economic side?
Well, yeah, I think now in Kremlin, they feel the situation like they have Easter, Christmas, and birthday in one day, since in terms of sanctions, the coalition looks like it was broken, or at least it has a major cracks. I mean, before the recent events, G7 countries doesn't have any mechanism to coordinate sanctions, and any mandatory mechanism to coordinate sanctions. So the sanctions coalition was a result of voluntarily coordination of actions between allies, and in Kremlin they're taking seriously sanctions from the US, European Union, and United Kingdom. The rest is not so important. So in my I think that sanctions have significantly changed Russia's economic policy, the geography of Russian exports. And they left, as I said previously, Russian nobility in an institutional vacuum and putting them into Putin's arms. And Russia has become more dependent on external factors than it was before the war. And now, in some extent, Russia, for an average investor, Russia is non-investable. So I think there is no magic sanctions left, but Trump's administration can take back what in Kremlin they think they already got. So they can restore the coalition in terms of sanctions, restore the Western coalition, And they continue to stifle the Russian economy with increasing pressure on shadow fleet, which means less export revenues, working with allies on financial sanctions and on secondary sanctions on intermediary countries and on the intermediary countries and on China, and developing common tools of economic deterrence instead of breaking coalition, I think.
In the time that remains, I'll ask the question. We'll start with Eric. Is there a deal, Eric? And if so, what would it look like? I spent the better part of my career in and around negotiations, usually not succeeding. I mean, they require urgency. They require two parties that are willing. They require mediation, and they require a realistic outcome that isn't just aspirational, that meets the needs and requirements of each side. Is anything like that remotely possible in the next year? Eric, to you?
Remotely possible, yes. I think in theory, there is a broad deal that can be reached, but it depends, like I said earlier, on the United States taking a much more coherent position in order to strengthen its and the West's and Ukraine's negotiating leverage vis-a-vis Russia. And that means, number one, the United States committing in some more serious way to have Ukraine's back militarily going forward. Number two, to stop the back and forth with Europe that's been really unproductive and get serious about, if it's going to renegotiate the balance of responsibility in NATO and for European security, to do this in a more coherent fashion that includes Ukraine, and really have a better sense of what Europe is willing to put up along what timeline to guarantee some sort of peace. And to have those conversations behind closed doors, probably, and not on Twitter and Truth Social and all of that. And to provide Ukraine with some sense of what the post-war security architecture is going to look like, so that they don't feel like they're going to be left on their own. I think if those ingredients can be put into place, and there's some discipline and a little bit of patience on the American side, I do think that you could, again, with Trump's willingness to engage personally with Putin, I think there is some possibility that you could land the plane and at least get some sort of cessation of hostilities with a security guarantee framework that Ukraine and the West work out, maybe which Russia just begrudgingly is forced to accept because it's a fait accompli. I don't think that you're going to get some sort of grand peace treaty where all the issues are resolved. I mean, these are too big, and the positions are too mutually exclusive to get to anything like that.
Agreed. But even if you got that, we're going to be left, aren't we, with a Russia problem? Because Russia will not abandon its territorial and political aspirations. It will reconstitute itself. I mean, all of this really does depend, I think, on a much more forward-leaning, risk-ready American role in Europe with NATO, security guarantees. Perhaps the Europeans do a lot more, for sure. But isn't that the broader strategic problem we're going to face as long as Putin is in office and maybe his successor? A concluding thought. I'd like to end on an upbeat note, but a concluding thought on this. Mike, I know you have a view on this. Andrew?
I'll briefly chime in there, and you know my views that Russian reconstitution is not an if but a when, and we are going to have an enduring challenge with Russia. Even if Putin is gone, and you shouldn't bank on that, because he's likely to be replaced by somebody that's ultimately a product of that system or that strategic culture, and many of the differences are going to remain, right? There isn't going to be somebody who parachutes in from a different country or a different planet to run Russia in a completely different manner. I think that, as you probably discern from a recent Foreign Affairs article in this winter edition I did with Henry Kendall Taylor, my suggestion was that there is often a temptation in any administration when they first come in to try to park the Russia relationship, somehow stabilize the situation with Russia so they can go focus on their priorities, which are typically the Pacific, something domestic, what have you. And that usually ends very badly and ends up blowing up in their face. And folks who think that you can easily just hand over the Russia problem set to Europeans right now, I think are engaging to a degree in wishful thinking because Europeans are not ready for it. Yes, that's always been their alibi. And yes, they need to be. And I'm somewhat chastened by the fact that Macron is here and he's actually talking about Europe putting together maybe a peacekeeping force. I think that's all a step in the right direction. But typically, the more that folks in Washington, D.C. communicate or indicate to the Russians that they're trying to stabilize relations and they want to compartmentalize them so they can move to something else, the more ambitious Russian foreign policy becomes and the bigger of a problem they end up engendering down the line. And the more costly of an issue it will become later in European security. At least that's been my experience observing the last couple decades.
Right. Andrew, final word from you?
I think the real pillars of U.S. foreign policy are in a state of transformation and flux with this new administration. And our former colleague and boss, Bill Burns, always said that, our alliances are America's greatest force multiplier. The durability of those alliances right now is being tested. Enlightened, and again, I'm just channeling classic Bill Burns formulations, but much of the U.S. role has, typically as leader of the system that emerged after '89, depended on some level of enlightened self-interest. And if everything is going to turn into a bilateral kind of, tussle and battle of wills, including with countries that are, formidable like Russia and China, it's going to be really hard to sort of bind others to a system the United States leads. I think we're going to see a lot more people straying, including in the case of Ukraine. Like the part of the benefit of the coalition that was created by President Biden was that we were corralling various countries, some of whom would have done things very differently. So, if we want to keep the allies that we've got on side, want to keep the Ukrainians basically aligned with us, like it's going to require a certain amount of give and take. We're not going to get everything we want.
Yeah, and I think we have to learn to turn the M in me. Is that right? Yeah. Turn the M in me upside down so it becomes a W in we. And that's not what I would argue. It's not a strong point for this administration. But look, I want to thank all of you. I mean, I learned a ton. You four are really the best. And thank you for your authority, your expertise, your wisdom, and your economy of language. We got a lot done in an hour plus. Thanks again. Till next time.